A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
Have you ever noticed how parents turn into competitive scouts the moment their kids start to move? It is like a high-stakes race where the finish line is just taking a few wobbly steps across the rug. If one baby walks at 10 months and another waits until 16, the parents of the 10-month-old act like they have birthed a future Olympian, while the others are quietly Googling physical therapy and wondering where they went wrong. It creates this incredible amount of milestone anxiety that seems to permeate every playgroup, every family gathering, and every social media feed. We have turned biological variability into a performance metric.
It really does feel like a competition, Corn, but the science suggests we are looking at the wrong scoreboard. I am Herman Poppleberry, and I have been diving deep into this because today's prompt from Daniel is all about these developmental timelines. He is asking why there is such a massive variation in when babies reach these milestones, like walking and talking, and whether it is just random noise or if there are hard biological and environmental drivers we can point to. Since Ezra is right in that age range now, I am sure this is something Daniel and Hannah are watching closely, probably with a mix of fascination and that classic parental, is this normal? Dread.
It is the perfect time to talk about it, because the landscape of what we consider normal has actually shifted quite a bit recently. I think people often forget that a milestone is not a deadline. It is not a train schedule where, if the train is 5 minutes late, the whole system is broken. It is a data point on a very long, very messy, and very individual curve. But when the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention changes the definitions of those points, as they have done over the last few years, it sets off a firestorm in the clinical community and among parents who are trying to find their bearings.
That is where the tension lies. Most people are used to thinking about the average, or the 50th percentile, as the goalpost. If the average baby walks at 12 months and your baby is at 13 months, you feel behind. But the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, in collaboration with the American Academy of Pediatrics, recently moved their benchmark for the Learn the Signs, Act Early, program to the 75th percentile. That means instead of looking at what half of babies can do, they're looking at what 3/4 of babies can do. The goal is to stop the wait-and-see approach that often delays intervention for kids who truly need it. They want to make it clear that if your child is not doing X by age Y, it is not just below average. It is a statistical outlier that warrants a conversation with a professional. But, as we will discuss, that shift has definitely ruffled some feathers, especially among speech-language pathologists.
Well, if we are looking at the why behind the variation, we have to start with the hardware. We cannot talk about behavior without talking about the brain and the genes that build it. I was reading about a landmark study from the University of Surrey that came out in May 2025. Professor Angelica Ronald led this massive look into the genetics of movement, specifically focusing on that first big milestone, walking. They found that about 24% of the variation in when a child starts walking is tied directly to their DNA. That is nearly a quarter of the equation determined before the kid even hits the floor. It is not just about how much tummy time they get, or how many colorful toys are just out of reach.
The fascinating part of that Surrey study is the specific mechanism they identified. They did not just find a walking gene. They identified 11 specific genetic markers that correlate with walking age. And here is the weird prompts. Twist. Several of those markers are involved in cortical ridge folding, or what scientists call gyrification. We're talking about the actual physical architecture of the brain surface, those folds and grooves that increase the surface area of the cortex. It suggests that the timing of those first steps is not just about leg strength or balance, or how chunky the baby's thighs are. It is about the rate of maturation in the motor cortex. The brain has to be physically ready to coordinate that level of complexity. The software of walking cannot run until the hardware of the cortical folds has reached a certain level of complexity.
I found one of their correlations particularly surprising, and I think it should give a lot of late walker parents a huge sigh of relief. Usually, we assume that hitting a milestone early is a sign of being ahead across the board, the gifted baby track. But Professor Ronald's research showed that walking later, as long as it is still within that typical window of 8 to 18 months, is genetically correlated with a lower risk of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and even higher educational attainment later in life. It is almost as if the brain is prioritizing different types of development. If you are not spending all your neural energy on gross motor coordination at 10 months, maybe those resources are going towards something else.
There is a very compelling theory in developmental biology that there are trade-offs in how the brain allocates its early energy. Think of it like a construction site with a limited number of workers. If a child is putting massive amounts of neural resources into motor coordination, spatial mapping, and the sheer physical demand of upright locomotion early on, those resources might be diverted from other areas of cognitive development that benefit from a slightly longer period of quiet maturation. It is not that one path is better than the other, but they represent different developmental strategies. Some kids are built to explore the physical world immediately. Others are built to process it from a stationary position for a bit longer.
It makes me think about the actual physical process of how this happens from the top down. We have these two technical terms that sound like something out of a Latin textbook, cephalocaudal and proximodistal. For those of us who did not go to med school, cephalocaudal basically means development happens from the head down to the tail. You see it in how a baby learns to control their neck muscles before they can sit up, and they can sit up before they can stand. Proximodistal means development moves from the center of the body outward. They can move their whole arm to swat at a mobile long before they have the fine motor control in their fingers to pick up a single Cheerio with a pincer grasp.
And the fuel for that progression, the literal insulation of the system, is myelination. Think of the nerves in a baby's body like raw, uninsulated copper wires. If you try to send a high-speed signal through a raw wire, the signal leaks. It is slow and it is prone to interference. Myelination is the process of coating those wires in a fatty sheath called myelin. This allows electrical signals to travel much faster and more efficiently. This process starts in the brainstem, the old part of the brain, and moves toward the cortex. It also moves down the spinal cord. Until those motor pathways leading to the legs are sufficiently myelinated, the signal from the brain to the legs is just too slow and fuzzy to maintain the incredibly complex balance required for walking.
So when we see that wide range of 8 to 18 months for walking, a lot of that is just the individual clock of myelination. Some kids are just fast trackers on the insulation front. Their biological electricians are working overtime. But I want to push on the connection between these motor skills and language, because that seems to be where things get really interesting, and where the system update concept we have talked about before really applies. There was some research in late 2025 in the journal Developmental Science about what they call the locomotor-language link. Apparently, the moment a baby starts walking, their vocabulary often explodes. It is not a coincidence. It is a functional shift.
That is one of the most elegant examples of second-order effects in human development. When a baby is crawling, their world is largely horizontal and limited. They are looking at the floor, their hands are occupied with the act of moving, and they are physically lower than everyone else. The moment they stand up and walk, two massive things happen. First, their visual perspective shifts. They are now looking at people's faces and the objects on tables rather than dust bunnies and chair legs. Second, their hands are suddenly free. This allows for what researchers call social bids. A walking infant can pick up an object, a ball, a shoe, a remote, carry it across the room, and hand it to a parent while making eye contact.
It changes the social contract of the household. A crawler is a passive recipient of the environment in many ways. They go where they can, but they are mostly down there. But a walker is an active solicitor of information. They are essentially saying, "Look at this thing I found. Tell me about it."
They are forcing the adults in the room to label the world for them. When a baby brings you a ball, you do not just stare at them, you say, "Oh, you brought me the blue ball. Thank you." That social interaction, triggered by the motor skill of walking, is what drives the language burst. It is not necessarily that the language center of the brain suddenly woke up on its own. It is that the new motor skill changed the environment in a way that fed the language center more high-quality data. It is a feedback loop. This is exactly what we discussed back in episode 12 and 5, System Update, Navigating the 9-Month Growth Spike. These systems, motor, sensory, and social, all hit a point of convergence.
That is a great way to frame it. It is not just about the internal clock, it is about how the internal clock changes the external feedback loop. But we also have to look at the environment before they are even born, because the range of normals starts way earlier than we realized. You mentioned that study from Children's National Hospital that came out just a few days ago, on March 17th, 2026. They were using fetal magnetic resonance imaging to look at brain development at 18 weeks in utero. This is cutting-edge stuff.
This study is a bit of a wake-up call for how we think about nature versus nurture. They found that environmental factors, specifically neighborhood disadvantage and high levels of maternal stress, were already showing up in the brain architecture of fetuses in the second trimester. They saw measurable differences in the regions associated with emotion and memory, like the amygdala and the hippocampus. It suggests that the range of normal we see at 12 months or 24 months is being shaped much earlier than we thought by the mother's environment and the physiological stress of her surroundings. The brain is already adapting to the world it expects to be born into.
It really underscores that the range of normal is not just a biological lottery. It is heavily influenced by the support systems around the mother. If the environment is signaling high stress or disadvantage, the fetal brain might be adapting in ways that prioritize immediate survival or emotional reactivity over the long-term cognitive milestones we measure later. It is a very early form of neuroplasticity. We are seeing the construction being altered by the weather outside the site.
And while that is happening, we are also seeing that cognitive milestones are occurring way before the motor ones, which contradicts a lot of the older textbooks that said babies are just blank slates for the first few months. Trinity College Dublin put out a study in February 2026 showing that 2-month-old infants can already categorize objects. They used neural firing patterns to show that these tiny babies can distinguish between a toy and a living animal. At 2 months, they cannot even hold their own heads up reliably, but their brains are already sorting the world into logical categories. The software is being installed while the chassis is still being bolted together.
That is wild. It makes you realize how much is happening under the hood while the baby is just lying there looking at a ceiling fan. We tend to judge development by what we can see, the walking and the talking, but the internal sorting system is online almost immediately. This brings us to the real hot-button issue right now, the controversy over the talking milestones. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the American Academy of Pediatrics, through their Learn the Signs, Act Early program, moved the threshold for a 50-word vocabulary from 24 months to 30 months. This is where Dr. Months, Paul Lipkin and the revision team have faced the most pushback, especially from the American Speech Language Hearing Association, or ISAJ.
And the pushback is intense. If you are a speech-language pathologist, you are on the front lines with kids who are struggling. If the official guidance says, don't worry until 30 months, but you know from clinical experience that a child with only 10 words at 2 years old is highly likely to have a developmental language disorder, you feel like the system is failing them. The critics argue that by lowering the bar, we are just delaying the point where kids get the help they need. They worry we are losing the early in early intervention.
I can see both sides. The logic on the other side, from people like Dr. Lipkin, is that the old milestones were based on the 50th percentile, the average. If you tell a room of 100 parents that their child should have 50 words by age 2, and 50 of those children do not, you have 50 panicked families flooding a system that does not have the capacity to see them all. Many of those kids are just late bloomers who will catch up naturally. By moving it to the 75th percentile, they are trying to identify the children who are truly outliers, the ones who have a much higher probability of a clinical issue, rather than just being on the slower end of the normal curve.
It is a classic triage problem. Do you cast a wide net and overwhelm the specialists with false positives? Or do you narrow the net and risk missing a few kids who could have benefited from earlier intervention? It is a tough balance, and as of March 2026, the debate is still very much alive. And then you have things like crawling being removed from the list entirely. That one surprised a lot of people because we have always been told that crawling is this crucial step for bilateral coordination and brain integration.
That is actually a bit of a myth that has been busted by recent data. While crawling is great for strength and coordination, it turns out that a significant percentage of perfectly healthy, high-achieving children just skip it. They bottom shuffle, or they go straight to pulling themselves up and walking. The research shows that skipping the crawling phase does not lead to long-term cognitive or motor deficits. So, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention removed it, because it was causing unnecessary alarm for parents whose kids were just finding a different way to get around. It was a milestone that wasn't actually a predictive marker for future health.
It is like the brain finds a workaround. If the goal is mobility, the brain will find the most efficient path available given the child's specific environment and physical build. This brings us back to Daniel's question about whether this variation is random. It sounds like it is a mix of 24% genetic hard coding, a significant amount of in utero environmental shaping, and then the sheer luck of how a child's individual experiences trigger those social feedback loops. It is a stochastic process, there is randomness, but it is constrained by biological rules.
I think we also have to consider the role of myelination again when we talk about language. The pathways for speech are incredibly complex. You have to coordinate the diaphragm, the vocal cords, the tongue, and the lips, all while processing the auditory feedback of your own voice in real time. That requires a massive amount of high-speed neural signaling. If the myelination in those specific speech motor tracks is moving a little slower, the child might understand everything you say. Their receptive language is fine, but they just cannot physically produce the words yet.
I have seen that toddler frustration firsthand. The child who knows exactly what they want but can only grunt and point. Their cognitive milestone, knowing the object and wanting to communicate, is way ahead of their motor speech milestone. It must be incredibly frustrating to have the neural architecture for object categorization at 2 months, but not have the vocal control to name those objects for another 2 years. It is like having a high-speed internet connection, but a broken keyboard.
It is a long game. One thing I find encouraging in the recent research is the emphasis on the range of normal, being a sign of human adaptability. We are not a species that is born ready to go, like a foal that can walk within an hour of birth. Our long period of helplessness is actually a feature, not a bug. It allows our brains to be shaped by the specific world we are born into. If we were hard-coded to walk at exactly 10 months, regardless of our environment, we would be much less flexible as a species. The variation is what allows us to adapt to different terrains, different social structures, and different levels of environmental stress.
And when we look at the 75th percentile shift, it is really about changing the conversation from, is my baby average, to, is my baby on a healthy trajectory? Those are two very different questions. A child could be in the 10th percentile for height and the 90th for head circumference and still be perfectly healthy. The same goes for milestones, the learn the signs. Act early. Program is a great tool for this because it gives parents specific things to look for that are not just about the big, flashy milestones like walking. It is about the subtle things, responding to their name, showing interest in other children, or using gestures like pointing. Those are often better predictors of long-term developmental health than the exact date they took their first step.
So, if you are a parent listening to this, and you are staring at your 10-month-old who is not even trying to pull up yet, the takeaway is not to panic. You have to look at the whole picture. Are they making eye contact? Are they categorizing objects in their own way? Are they making those social bids, even if it is just through gestures? It feels like we are moving toward a more nuanced understanding, where we can use tools like fetal magnetic resonance imaging to identify kids who truly need help before they are even born, while also giving the rest of the population the breathing room to develop on their own clock. It is about precision medicine versus the old one-size-fits-all approach.
The precision aspect is key, but it also brings up the big ethical question of 2026. If we can see these patterns in utero, or through genetic markers, do we risk creating a self-fulfilling prophecy? If a parent knows their child has the genetic markers for walking at 18 months, do they treat that child differently? Genetic determinism is a dangerous road. We have to remember that genetics only accounted for 24% of the variation in the Surrey study. That leaves 76% for everything else: the environment, the nutrition, the social interactions, and the sheer randomness of being a human. DNA is the blueprint, but it is not the finished building.
I like that. The blueprint sets the boundaries, but the construction process is where the real life happens. And for parents who are concerned, organizations like the American Speech Language, Hearing Associations still encourage early screening. Even if the official milestone moved, you can still seek out an evaluation at 18 or 24 months if your gut tells you something is off. Parents are often the best observers of their own children's trajectories. The recent revisions were designed to empower parents to act earlier when they see a problem, not to tell them to wait longer. If a child is not meeting that 75th percentile milestone, it is a clear signal that it is time for a deeper look. It takes the guesswork out of it.
It really is a system update, as we talked about back in episode 1205. That 9-month growth spike is a perfect example of all these systems hitting a point of convergence. And if you want to understand more about that transition from simple sounds to full sentences, definitely check out episode 516, From Squawks to Sentences, The Mystery of Language. We went deep into the mystery of language acquisition there, and it fits perfectly with what we discussed today about the language burst that follows walking.
It all connects. No milestone exists in a vacuum. Everything is feeding into everything else. Well, I think we have given Daniel plenty to chew on for his next update on Ezra. It is a lot to take in, but it is ultimately a very hopeful picture of how resilient and adaptable human development really is. It is about celebrating the variation rather than fearing it.
I agree. It is a fascinating time to be looking at this, especially with the explosion of new data from the last couple of years. We are finally getting past the stage of just observing babies and starting to understand the actual mechanisms, from the cortical ridges to the myelination of the spinal cord.
That is a good place to wrap it up. Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes.
And a big thanks to Modal for providing the graphics processing unit credits that power our research and production pipeline. We literally could not do this without that horsepower.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are finding these deep dives helpful, leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. It really does help other curious people find the show.
You can also find our full archive and subscribe to our newsletter at myweirdprompts.com. We have over 1,400 episodes there covering everything from quantum biology to the history of automation.
We will be back next time with another prompt from Daniel. Until then, keep asking the weird questions.
See you then.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to